Hello, welcome back to the Elements of the Spiritual Life. I'm Father Jason Ingalls, the rector at Holy Spirit Episcopal Church in Waco, Texas. Over the previous 8 sessions, we've been working through 20th century Anglican theologian F.P. Harton's book, The Elements of the Spiritual Life. We have just wrapped up our discussion of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. These virtues are infused in us at our baptism. They are a result of the Holy Spirit of the living God coming to dwell in us. Because of that indwelling Spirit, there is a constant fountain of grace bubbling up within us, and we are called to cooperate with that grace by growing in faith, hope, and love. Today, we're starting to look at the cardinal virtues of justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence. These virtues originally appeared in Greek philosophy, but they were taken up into Christian reflection in the early days of the Christian church. They are like the theological virtues in that they are infused into us, but instead of that infusion happening at baptism, it happens by virtue of our coming into existence. They are broadly human virtues given by God in creation. Since they are already within us, growing in them is about cooperating with the grace that God has already given to us in creation. Why wait until after the theological virtues to talk about the natural virtues? Because for the Christian, the cardinal virtues are lifted up and transformed by the theological virtues. Justice, for instance, might look very cold and cruel in some people, but can never be so for the baptized. The same is true of the other 3 virtues as well. Harton writes, the cardinal virtues, in conjunction with the theological virtues, build up the Christian character and regulate our action with regard to our fellow people and ourselves. They are 4 in number: justice, which governs our conduct toward others; temperance and fortitude, which concern ourselves; and prudence, which governs the other 3. We start today with justice. We aren't really used to thinking about justice in the way our fathers and mothers did. I hear the word justice thrown about in American political terms, and I think that's the only way we see it. Justice is equal protection under the law. We talk about social justice, which is the fight to change laws or the application of laws so that people are respected according to their human dignity. We shy away from notions of justice that have to do with duty. Because of our preoccupation with authenticity, we are automatically suspicious of anything that smacks of obligation. We Christians are much more comfortable with a spiritual-sounding word, righteousness. It sounds more spontaneous and less obligatory than justice. Harton points out that in the Greek, the word for righteousness and justice are the same. It is a misfortune, he writes, that we have divorced righteousness completely from the sense of justice. There is too great an idea of freedom in the popular conception of righteousness. It may truly be given or withheld, and like all virtues is valueless unless freely willed. Nevertheless, it is not an act of grace on the part of the creature, but a debt which is due from him to his Creator, whose will is expressed in the revealed law. Those statements are profoundly important. Justice is not an act of grace. It is not something we should be lauded for. This is not a pat on the back kind of thing. Justice is an obligation, a duty that we owe to all people. And as Christians, we believe we owe it to all people because justice is an obligation to our Creator. Fundamentally, Harton writes, justice as a virtue is the God-given love of right. This, Harton believes, this love of right is what links the concepts of righteousness and justice. Quote, and the just or righteous person wills to give all people their rights according to the will of God. So justice is not about getting our rights. It is about making sure others get theirs, not as an act of grace, but because we owe it to them. We owe other people their rights. And this natural justice is taken up and transformed by grace. Quote, this conception of duty is vital to true religion, and inflamed by charity, informed by faith, and idealized by hope, it will be the directing force of our whole life Godward. Just like charity, justice has two directions, towards God and towards others. Harton writes, "Towards God, the virtue of justice finds its expression in worship. This is the primitive human reaction to any true apprehension of the divine. It is also the fundamental action of the most spiritual religion, because it is the fulfillment by the creature of his creaturely duty towards his Creator. Once God is realized as God, worship is seen to be God's right, and this conception lies at the root of true religion, expressed inwardly in adoration and outwardly in sacrifice and worship." Unquote. Isn't it a funny thought that we can do justice towards God, that worship is the justice that God is owed? It feels funny, but it's true. And Harton is quick to point out that justice towards God is overcome in the spiritual life by charity. What begins as obligation becomes an act of love towards God. We worship because God is owed worship, yes, but the real reason we worship is love. But what about justice towards people? Harton writes, "Towards people, justice is the glad and constant rendering to others of their rights. The insistence upon one's own rights and the demand for freedom of self-expression is a common enough vice among Christians as well as others. The consistent recognition of the rights of other people is somewhat less pervasive. Nevertheless, there can hardly be a right practice of the Christian religion without it." Again, like in justice for God, justice for people means giving them their rights. And the justice we show to people should eventually be overcome by charity. But the obligation of justice is the right first step. It creates the possibility for true love to blossom, bloom, and bear fruit. Justice is the negation of selfishness, Harton writes, for it is essentially other-regarding. But it is not merely other-regarding. It differs from philanthropy or social righteousness in caring for the rights of people, not because they are the rights of people, but because they are the will of God for them. Taken up by the theological virtues, the virtue of justice wants to give others their rights because it is God's will that they have their rights. Think of the profundity of that. When we refuse to run a red light, we are doing God's will for the others at the intersection. When we take the time to listen to someone in pain, we are doing God's will for that person. When we stand up for justice for all people, we are doing the will of God for all, not because we're great, but because we owe it to them, because it is God's desire for all people that justice be done. I don't know. Justice seems like a lot of work. And what happens to me when I care more about others' rights than my own? Won't I be run over and left behind? Harton says no. As we grow in justice, we grow into people full of graciousness and love for God and others. Harton writes, "Justice produces in the soul ordinate affection, broad-mindedness in its true sense, and essential magnanimity. The just person can never be small-minded or habitually bad-tempered. There is great reward in justice. It just doesn't look like the reward we expect. As we order our lives towards justice, we will find everything coming into place. The just person cares for God and God's will first, their neighbor in God second, and themselves last. And selfishness is seen to be but an intrusive element in a world which the justice of God has made right." In conclusion, the cardinal virtue of justice is essentially the God-given love of right. As it is picked up and transformed by faith, hope, and love, it becomes the bedrock of our spiritual lives. At the very least, there are things we owe to one another, and no matter how we feel, we can do those things. Justice keeps us focused on God and one another. It keeps us from the trap of selfishness. It transforms us into someone who looks a lot more like Jesus. So this week, pay attention to what you owe to your family, your friends, and to God. And give it. And see what kind of difference it makes as you become and share the good news of Jesus Christ. Next time, we'll continue exploring the cardinal virtues by exploring temperance and fortitude. I look forward to seeing you then.